Greetings, abstraction students. I hope this finds you well. Welcome to week one of our 8-week journey through theories of abstraction. And what I'll be doing each week will be emailing you on Monday morning each week's readings, the discussion prompt, providing an outline of how to approach the readings, what I think is important for you to consider as you do the readings, and also a video introduction, as this is, in which I will face-to-face, as it were, give you a sense of what I'm thinking about for this week and how it can guide your thinking and your reading, and again, and your writing as well. Which I want you to consider as an extension of your thinking. And so I want your writing to show me that you are wrestling with the readings, that you are taking seriously the implications of these readings, not only in the context of this class, but in the context of your studies in general. For I conceive of each class in this program to interact with, connect, provide opportunities to further develop, to find different ways of approaching other courses and other subjects that you've studied in other courses. So I see this as, and I see this, and perhaps in particular this course weaving its way through, or perhaps you could say braiding, or providing a thread that unifies this course of study that you've engaged in, because abstraction is really in many ways the paradigmatic example of modern art history and criticism and theory. That is a painting, a means of representation that we have been trained through the Renaissance tradition, which has become the Western pictorial tradition since the 15th century, that painting is a representation of what we experience and what we see in the world, that it is mimetic, that it represents what we see, it corresponds to what we see, and that reality is what we can observe visually. And this aspect of the visuality of painting, which controls our experience, which provides a visual concept of the world out there that exists beyond our conscience, beyond our cognition, that can be empirically, visually, visibly verifiable, has been, and for the vast majority of people, and I would say in our lives, in our daily lives, as we're not putting on our art hats or art historical hats, it's how we operate. Visual imagery represents reality as we see it, and what we see corresponds to reality. But abstraction operates as this revelation that may not be the case, that there is something else, that there is something more to painting, that there is something more to reality. And that you could say perhaps that within the whole program of modern art history, criticism and theory that you're undertaking, that it's the question of abstract art that is really the unasked question. And it's unasked. It's the elephant in the room because the answers are so difficult. And it gets at the depth of what, and the implications of what painting can be. And not only painting and artistic practice, but also what we say about art, how we talk about it, how we think about it, how we write about it. which is what theory and criticism are about. And so this class is not, over these 8 weeks, I'm not just going to give you a survey of the development of abstract painting or the abstract art as if it justifies its own existence simply because it's a historical phenomenon. But we're going to unpack it. We're going to unpack its origins in modernity, cultural modernity, unpack its origins in the Enlightenment, and what it reveals about cognition, epistemology, that is, how we know anything in the world. And what it implies about how we experience the world. And that the visual arts, although they use the visual organ, the ocular organ, the eye, which is the most controlled, judgmental organ that we have. It judges others. It provides for those snap judgments that we need to keep ourselves from being run over by a car. By finding that right turn we need to make. By finding an attractive person that we want to talk to at a reception or a party. And so our visuality is the primary means by which we control the world, control our world. Give it a sense of order. I was listening to a lecture about artificial intelligence, and the lecturer was talking about how scientists and engineers were so surprised by a very simple phenomenon, and that is they thought they would be able to generate visual organs, and that the question about the task for the artificial intelligence would be to process what is seen. But what they didn't realize was that the very apparatus of visualization, the very apparatus of seeing, takes up so much, how would I say, brain space, that what it reveals is that we as human beings, our ocular senses, our visuality, takes up a tremendous percentage of our intelligence. And so we are operating as these visual creatures, eyes rooting around the world, judging, asserting. And that the visual arts are an extension of that, an iteration of that. And yet, what the visual arts do, which I would suggest to you separates it from other forms of visual culture, is that while it uses vision, grants it, declares, look at me. It also says something else, that there is more than meets the eye. There is more there. It cannot be contained. A painting cannot be consumed by the glance, by the 30 seconds that the Getty revealed after doing field research that the average visitor takes for looking at each work of art. And can you imagine a painter devoting his or her life to making paintings that individuals would look at for 30 seconds, passing on their way to the bathroom at the museum? or taking a quick glance and a quick judgment. A painter who agonizes for 6 months every day on a painting is painting a picture for a person to look at it and in 30 seconds make a judgment, or to feel or to believe that they have experienced all that can be experienced visually by the work. And so in many ways, what modernity is, what abstraction then is an outgrowth of, a visual aesthetic outgrowth of, is the development in the Enlightenment that reality is more than what you see. And we've seen this replicated. We've seen this proven in modern science. Physics has demonstrated through mathematics that 99% of the world, the cosmos, is invisible to the eye. There is simply just a fraction of the cosmos that is available to your vision and to my vision. And yet the visual arts operate in this framework. This 1%, that, however, so much of our brain workings, our biological machinery is generated to providing, that it reveals, on one hand, our vision is incredibly important, and one could even say dominant, and yet on the other hand it's deceptive. That there's more than that. That we run the risk of always assuming that what we see is the way the world is. And then I would suggest to you the best of the Western pictorial tradition, from the Renaissance to the present, reveals through painting, through the visual arts, in this tension that the world is and yet is more than visual. And abstraction hits at the heart of that, forces us to confront that and give an account of that to others, to our students, or for me as a museum curator in the context of giving a tour with lay people in the public who are just interested in learning about art, who are trained to think about art in the context of watching Sister Wendy Beckett or watching some PBS show in which Michelangelo's Sistine Ceiling or Leonardo's Mona Lisa is talked about as a great work of art, and then watching our friend on PBS painting happy trees, and having Thomas Kinkade pictures in our living room. How do I give an account to them about a Picasso painting, or about a painting that just consists of colors splashed on a flat surface? How do I talk to them about it being a manifestation of art, and a powerful manifestation of art, with all of those images of Thomas Kinkade, of the happy trees, of the Hallmark cards, of the great masterpieces of the Western tradition that wow us because of their realism and their naturalism? And so how do we give an account for that for those who want to know? And yet how do we do so also recognizing the importance of theory, criticism. That the visual arts are more than just what our society presumes them to be. The criticism of, my kid can do that, looking at a Jackson Pollock painting, for example, is a serious challenge. And often we are not up to the challenge. And instead of shrugging our shoulders and saying, I don't know, I've just been taught this, we kind of shrug it off and call them Philistines. Well, we need to deal with it. We need to deal with it, and we need to deal with certain realities about the perception, about the audience for painting, about the audience for the visual arts. For whom does an artist make work? Who does the artist think about or conceive of when he or she is making the work? Conceive of as the person that stands before it. Is it the person that doesn't like art? Is it the person that has Thomas Kinkade prints? Is it a person who's an expert, a philosopher, an art historian? I would suggest to you that those individuals are not what the artist is painting for. So how is it that we can think about abstraction? Or take this as a case in point. You're a high school teacher, you're a middle school art teacher, and you're presenting the work of Jackson Pollock. How do you do so in a way that connects with the students? That doesn't require you to have to trot out half-understood theory and philosophy to presume that the students then have to know about philosophy to be able to understand the work. And yet also be able to connect that painting by Jackson Pollock, or connect abstraction as a stylistic development to Renaissance painting. How do you connect it? How do you reveal its radical difference and also its deep connection? And that is something I want to emphasize and focus on in this class. Don't want to quarantine abstraction and just be content in tracing a development and the theory that's emerged from it. So we're going to start with a much bigger picture. It's a much more complicated picture. And yet it's also a complicated picture that will help us simplify our experience of abstract art in order for us to be able to share it with those who want to know, with those who are curious, to open up a window in their imagination, create space in their imagination in which abstract art, whatever that means, and we're going to have to look at a whole spectrum of what that means. Because quite frankly, even a painting by Leonardo or Michelangelo or Raphael is an abstract painting. But to be able to unpack that and share that for our students, for lay people, that is, not experts, not people who are devoting graduate class, devoting their every ounce of minute of their spare time to graduate training in art history. I mean, and the trajectory of abstraction that we'll be looking at is a trajectory from the middle of the 19th century, late of the 19th century, beginning with Impressionism, through Jackson Pollock. A trajectory of abstraction that is 150 years old, and yet it still haunts us because we understand the visual arts, and we understand visuality in a particular way that privileges what is seen before us, and recognizing and presuming that what art does is represent what we see. But I would suggest to you that the best of the visual arts in the Western pictorial tradition does something else, does something more, without denigrating what we see, and understanding that how we experience the world is often through our visual conceptual apparatus, that it gives us something more about the world. Now, in a spiritual and faith-based context, a biblical context, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is inextricable from the Western pictorial tradition, this is significant because it's Jesus who criticizes those who will judge the virtue of a person by what they look like, by their wealth, by their power. And it's the example of the gospel, the truth of the gospel, that what you see is not the truth. That it is God who's hanging from that cross. It is not a criminal hanging on that piece of wood, hanging on that tree outside of the walls of Jerusalem. That is God. Defies everything, defies all of our visual logic and our visual experience. For all intents and purposes, what we see when we see Jesus loving his neighbors, we see him cavorting with sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, defiling himself with the lowest and the marginalized. So what we see distorts the way things are. And I would suggest to you, abstraction emerges as a way to probe through what we see, to try to get at that reality that cannot be contained by our visual experience, and yet can only be communicated, embodied by our visual experience. That's what makes, for me, it's what makes painting, in particular painting, because it generates a particular kind of abstraction in general. An imaginative projection that the viewer has to make, that sculpture less so. Sculpture operates as an object in the world that can overwhelm us simply by its sheer size. It confronts us as another being in the world, as another object. I, as an object, confronts another object. It can be smaller, it can be larger, I can walk around it. It's an object that has a place in the world. But a painting, not quite so. By hanging it on a nail on a wall and forcing me to go in it conceptually, imaginatively, it forces me to do something active. Its function is none other than to project that, a certain kind of presence. It doesn't have the same kind of status as an artifact, an object, in the way that sculpture does. And so painting will be the primary means by which we work through these challenges. And the readings this week are going to begin with not necessarily the initial readings in abstract painting, but in representation, in the foundational text of the theory of Western painting. That is Leon Battista Alberti's treatise on painting, which he published in the 1430s. both in Italian and in Latin. He published it in Latin so it could be read by the humanists, participate in that great tradition, that Latin language tradition that the Florentine humanists were engaging, but that it would also connect to the lay public, the literate lay public. And his articulation of representation, of what the painter is supposed to do in terms of how the painter understands linear perspective, and how that perspective opens up the flat surface, makes it function as a window through which the viewer imaginatively projects into that work, is an apotheosis of mimesis, of representation. And yet is also a form of abstraction. For the painter abstracts from the world, the complexity of experience, to reduce it to fundamental features that can be reproduced visually. And that it is the connection of the viewer to the work of art, the continuity of the viewer's space into the fictional space, the created space of the painter, that creates this. But it is created. The abstract painter and the Renaissance painter load a brush full of pigment and smear it across a flat surface, paper, canvas, wood. The basic presumption is that the abstract painter and the representational painter use the same resources, begin the same way. It's still brush stroke upon brush stroke next to brush stroke on a flat surface. And so, as the modernist critic Clement Greenberg said, Giotto and Duccio are great abstract painters, and abstraction, modern abstraction, teaches us to look at those painters through the eyes of abstraction, and something else emerges. New aspects. So instead of seeing what the 13th century Florentine or the Sienese viewer would see in the Duccio painting and see as a dynamic representation of the Madonna and the Child, the 20th century secular modernist art critic sees incredible formal organization and powerful color juxtaposition, and brings out Duccio's capacity to organize form, line, and color, which is the basic building blocks of either representational painting or abstract painting. And so this week you'll be reading Alberti's On Painting. Read it in the context of abstraction, and you'll be struck with just how abstract Alberti is, using mathematical principles, the notion of creating illusions. I also gave you a chapter from a philosopher I find to be very helpful. His name is Andrew Bowie. He's based at Cambridge. He writes about German philosophy and aesthetics. And the chapter that I've included is his chapter on Kant's aesthetics and the importance of the Enlightenment for helping us understand that representation is not simply a passive response to what we see in the world, but it's active. That knowledge, for Kant, knowledge is only possible. The object of our knowledge is only possible with the involvement, the creative intuition, and the participation of the subject. Which means, for Kant and his critique of Enlightenment reason, is that knowledge is going to always be subjective. The difficulty of finding the truth, and that the truth is in reality my experience and expression of the truth, and that truth emerges only by virtue of my experience of it and my way of my creative intuition. And so for Kant, aesthetics is crucial because it's aesthetics that is dealing with creative intuition, with the imagination, with ways of trying to understand the continuity of me, what goes on between my ears and in my head, and its continuity with me outside of that. And for those of you that have my classes before, I continue to repeat this. The basic structure of modernity, what the Enlightenment wrought, is that with that, the crumbling of the church and the church's dogma and understanding of the world, say according to the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, in which Aquinas weds Aristotle to biblical principles, that there is a reality that operates separate from us, that is defined within the context of Christian dogma and Christian teaching. And so that the church provides this framework within which the world makes sense. And the world is how I understand myself, how I understand in my relationship to the world, how I understand the world in relationship to me, and how I understand my relationship to God, how it fits. The crumbling of that through modernity, through the Renaissance, through the Reformation, into the Age of Reason, through Enlightenment, and with Kant at the end of the 18th century, is that those structures, the stability of understanding who I am in relationship to God and the world, and how nature operates, and how it operates in relationship to me, how I fit, falls apart. And it has to be reconstructed again. And Kant says, I believe in God, but that's not doing philosophy. And so let's develop a philosophy. Let's develop a philosophy of the human being and of truth and of nature that is separate from belief in God. So we'll bracket God, and we'll try to put this all together again. Put what the church had woven together, we'll put it together again, but we won't include God in teaching, church teaching. And so then Kant runs into all kinds of problems, challenges. How the human being now is being structured very differently. I would suggest to you that modern visual arts participate in that restructuring, trying to re-sew those torn bits into a tapestry that makes sense. And it's difficult, and it creates problems. And the various basic questions of my experience of the world. Is my experience of the world the same as your experience of the world? Isn't as obvious anymore. And it becomes problematic. And what if this is the case, that the only way the truth emerges is through my participation in it and my interpretation of it? Is my interpretation of the truth the same as yours? And this is what the visual arts in the modern tradition, and in particular abstraction, deal with. Poses this question, that the world is not as stable as we presume it to be, and that we have to find new ways of providing answers to these questions. Who am I? Who am I in relationship to my neighbor, to the world, to God or a judge, or what I give an account to? Who do I give an account to? And so the art and abstraction become, in a very interesting way, a theological practice in paint. And what does it mean to be spiritual? When we think about Courbet in the 1850s being asked by a student why he doesn't paint angels, and he says, if you show me one, I'll paint one. Well, I would suggest to you that abstraction is a means by which there is a renewed desire to paint what can't be seen, but might exist nonetheless. Is it possible that abstraction in painting is an exercise of faith in paint? Faith in what? We'll explore that. So the reading, Bowie's reading is tough reading, but I want you to be thinking about abstract painting and how abstraction operates in this. And then I've given you two other texts by two philosophers, Robert Pippin and Paul Crowther. Paul Crowther is a Kant specialist. Pippin is a Hegel specialist. They're both writing about abstract art, and I thought they would be very interesting to you as to read, to give you a certain overview of this question of abstraction. And so the question of what is real, and is the world only to be experienced visually, is what painting gives us only what everyone sees, or does it do something else and do something more? I would suggest to you that all painting does something more, but that abstraction reveals that. Its uniqueness and also its contiguousness with this Western tradition. And it's not insignificant. And we'll be looking at icons, for it's the Eastern Church's tradition of icon painting that provides a really interesting connection to abstraction, because it is the Eastern practice of icon painting that self-consciously, dogmatically, theologically, or does so for theological reasons, reject Western perspective. And it argues that a painting is more than meets the eye. And so in an amazing way, Pollock and Andrei Rublev, the Russian icon painter, meet at that truth, that painting is more than meets the eye. So I hope these thoughts are helpful to you. I am really excited for this class. What I'm hoping to do is, as you do your reading and you write your discussion prompts, email them directly to me by Sunday night. You guys work. You guys are doing this on the weekends. I'm giving you the full weekend. Email me your discussion prompts by this coming Sunday night. I will then respond to them as soon as I can early in the week with in-depth responses. If you want to post them on Canvas to develop a conversation with other students, you are free to do so, but you don't have to. But then by the end of the week, that next week, so next Friday, I'll do a video chat like this, which will deal with what I see to be recurring questions that come up in those discussion prompts. And I will then also I will try each Friday. This coming Friday, there's no doubt something throughout this week that will come up that I'll want to share with you. So I'll do so. Be aware I may email you some other things and some other thoughts I may have, some other connections and links. And feel free to email me directly with any questions or comments, conversations. Open up a thread. We can talk via email. I'm really excited about this class, and I'm really committed to the subject. And I think it's something that we can easily overlook, and it's something that's crucial for us to connect with if we are committed also in the work that we do as teachers or in the museum or wherever in terms of sharing our passion with those who are curious and want to know, even those that are skeptical too. So with that, I wish you a great week. Take care.